In the year 921, an Arab diplomat stood on the banks of a cold northern river and saw something that made him stop writing and start fearing history itself. Women, European women, sat chained at the neck, silent, dressed to be sold, their eyes already empty. These were not prisoners of war, they were merchandise. What you were taught about the Vikings is incomplete, because their greatest export was not ships, not silver, but human lives. Tonight, using forgotten manuscripts and eyewitness accounts, I will show you what happened to the women who vanished into the Viking slave trade, and why history worked so hard to make you forget them.
The lamp that should never have been lit. He thought he had seen the limits of human cruelty. He was wrong, because on this river, silence is trained, fear is profitable, and women are priced higher than gold. And one stare from a chained captive will haunt history for 1,000 years. The year is 921, and the Volga River moves slowly under a gray, uncaring sky, carrying trade, ambition, and human lives toward destinations they will never choose. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an educated emissary of the Abbasid Caliphate, sits beneath a flickering oil lamp and feels something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not fear of attack, not diplomatic tension, but the creeping realization that he is witnessing a system so refined, so organized, that cruelty itself has become routine. Across the riverbank stretches the camp of the Rus traders, the Northmen who have dragged their longships down forests and rivers from the Baltic, not just carrying furs and amber, but something far more valuable to the markets of the south. Women, dozens of them, chained at the neck in precise groups, iron collars biting into skin already marked by bruises that tell a story of repeated correction, not chaos. Their linen garments flap uselessly in the cold wind, thin by design, revealing bodies to buyers' eyes even before the market begins. No one is screaming, no one is resisting, and that is what chills Ibn Fadlan most, because he recognizes the expression on their faces immediately, the empty stillness of people who have learned that emotion is punished and invisibility is survival. He watches traders move among them with calm efficiency, tightening chains, inspecting limbs, lifting chins, checking teeth and eyes like livestock. They speak softly, casually, as if discussing grain yields or timber quality, occasionally laughing, occasionally negotiating, never lowering their voices when they speak of women as merchandise. There is no rage here, no frenzy, only business. Then he sees her. Slightly apart from the others, limited by the same chain, but separated by will alone, sits a woman with hair the color of dulled copper and skin so pale the marks on her arms look like ink stains on parchment. She does not look at the men. She does not look at the camp. She stares at the river as if it is the last familiar thing left in the world, as if memory itself is flowing away with the current. Ibn Fadlan learns in fragments. She was taken from a Frankish settlement more than a year ago, dragged across rivers and roads, sold, resold, evaluated, renamed into numbers and categories. Her real name no longer matters. To the traders, she is inventory. To the buyers downstream, she will be an investment. He watches a trader lift her chin, not violently but with practiced precision, tilting her face toward the firelight to check for illness, weakness, signs that would lower her price. He nods once. Approval. The woman does not react. That frightens Ibn Fadlan more than tears ever could. Tears mean hope still exists. This emptiness means hope has already been beaten out of her, measured, and found unprofitable. As night settles, the camp grows quieter, but the chains remain awake, clinking softly whenever someone shifts. Ibn Fadlan moves closer under the pretense of observation, close enough to hear breathing, close enough to smell damp iron and fear disguised as obedience. The women do not speak to one another. He realizes this is intentional. Isolation is not a consequence of captivity, it is a tool. A trader passes, counting under his breath, stopping briefly at the copper-haired woman, exchanging a few words with another man. One word reaches Ibn Fadlan clearly through the translator, and it lands like a sentence of death. Bulgar. He knows Bulgar. He knows its markets, its buyers from Persia and Arabia, its silver, its hunger for fair-skinned women from the cold north. In that single word, the woman's future collapses into a narrow corridor with no exits. This is not raiding. This is not war. This is infrastructure. Capture, transport, preparation, sale. Each step refined over generations. A machine designed to turn human beings into profit. Ibn Fadlan returns to his lamp and opens his journal, his hand trembling despite years of discipline. He understands now why so many histories soften this truth, why sagas prefer ships and heroes and exploration. To write this is to admit that civilization itself can be built on chains. As he dips his pen, the copper-haired woman finally turns her head. Her eyes meet his across the firelight. There is no plea in them, no panic, only certainty. The knowledge that the river is not carrying her toward a place, but erasing her from every life she once had. And in that moment, Ibn Fadlan realizes the most disturbing truth of all. This camp is not the horror. It is only the entrance. What waits next is worse, quieter, and far more profitable.
Capture was not chaos, it was design. They were not taken in madness, they were selected. Every scream, every chain, every choice followed a cold logic. Because in this world, mercy was waste, and waste meant lost silver. The copper-haired woman did not fall into captivity by accident, and neither did the thousands like her. Long before iron touched her neck, before the river carried her away from everything she knew, men had already decided her fate without knowing her name. Viking capture was not the reckless violence of drunken raiders crashing blindly into villages. It was a calculated operation built on experience, profit, and repetition. The Northmen learned quickly which places yielded the best human cargo: monasteries near rivers, farming settlements with little defense, trading towns that trusted distance or God to protect them. Raids were timed to seasons when rivers were navigable and roads passable, when captives could be moved quickly before resistance gathered. Speed mattered, not for mercy, but for efficiency. The longer a raid lasted, the more likely valuable captives would be injured or killed, and injury reduced price. When the raid began, selection happened in minutes. Warriors were trained to read bodies and behavior at a glance. Youth meant survival. Clear eyes meant health. Strong posture meant endurance. Women who froze in fear were easier to control than those who fought wildly. The elderly slowed the group and were left behind. The very young often did not survive transport and were considered bad investments. Those deemed unprofitable were killed without ceremony, not from cruelty, but because they had no place in the system. The copper-haired woman had been noticed immediately: her age, her appearance, her lack of visible illness. She was bound with leather strips, linked into a moving chain of captives, and marched away while the raid was still unfolding behind her. Fires burned, bells rang, people screamed, but she was already gone. From that moment, her identity began to dissolve. Names were dangerous because names encouraged memory, and memory encouraged resistance. Captives were grouped not by family or language, but by convenience. Communication was discouraged, then punished. Silence was enforced early because silence traveled well. On ships, captives were kept low, exposed to wind and rain, fed just enough to remain alive. Hunger was not a mistake, it softened defiance. Thirst was controlled carefully. Too little weakened the body.
Too much encouraged strength. The balance was deliberate. Every step of transport served a purpose, and none of it was improvised. At the first collection point, captives were sorted again. This was the moment when fear turned into insecurity. Traders examined their human cargo like craftsmen evaluating raw material. Who would endure long journeys? Who would fetch high prices in distant markets? Who would be sold quickly, cheaply, and forgotten? Women who showed intelligence or skill were marked, not spared. Skill increased value, and value increased suffering. A woman who could read, weave, manage a household, or learn languages was worth more alive and obedient than dead. Those who resisted too visibly were punished in front of others, not excessively, just enough to demonstrate consequence. One example was usually enough. This is the part history prefers to blur, the moment when violence ends and administration begins, when chains stop rattling and ledgers open, when a human being is no longer a victim of war, but a unit of trade moving through an established network. By the time captives reached major trading centers, they were no longer screaming. That work had already been done upstream, far from witnesses, far from records, far from the heroic stories later told about Viking courage and exploration. And the copper-haired woman, standing now on the edge of a greater market world, had not yet faced the worst part, because capture was only the first test. What awaited her next was not raw brutality, but something colder and far more effective. The places where captives were prepared, where fear was refined into obedience, and where survival itself became another form of loss.
Where women were turned into merchandise. The screams stopped here, but the damage deepened. This was not a prison, it was a workshop, and what they crafted was obedience that could be sold. Dublin did not look like a place of horror to an outsider. It smelled of salt, wood smoke, and trade, its quays crowded with goods from across the known world. Ships unloaded furs, wine, metalwork, and human beings under the same rules of commerce. Hidden behind the noise of bargaining and the clatter of tools were the structures that mattered most to the slave trade, the quiet compounds where captives were processed before sale. This was where the copper-haired woman was taken after weeks of transport, exhaustion, and fear. Not dragged violently, not beaten publicly, but guided through gates into enclosed yards where routine replaced chaos. The first thing done was cleaning. Bodies were washed, hair combed, wounds inspected. This was not mercy. Dirt and blood lowered value. Traders understood that buyers paid more for captives who appeared healthy, calm, and intact. Food followed, not enough to restore strength, only enough to restore appearance. A few days of bread, broth, and rest could turn a half-starved captive into something that looked desirable again. It was an investment, calculated and precise. After cleaning came assessment, the moment when fear shifted into humiliation. Experienced traders examined women carefully, recording what could be sold and what could not. Teeth were checked. Skin was inspected for marks that might suggest illness. Limbs were tested for strength. Skills were probed with casual questions. Could she weave? Could she sew? Could she understand commands quickly? Literacy, once a source of pride, became a mark of higher value and therefore higher risk. The copper-haired woman was separated again, moved into a smaller group reserved for those deemed promising. This separation was deliberate. Isolation broke solidarity. It made each woman feel alone in her fate, competing silently against others for survival. They were dressed in cleaner garments, given small ornaments, not as gifts, but as display tools. Each change stripped away another layer of the person she had been, replacing it with a version designed to please unknown buyers. Then began the part no trader described openly, the stage hidden behind phrases like training and teaching manners. This was where resistance was dismantled carefully, because broken bodies sold poorly. The methods were subtle, repetitive, and effective. Captives were taught when to lower their eyes, when to stand, when to move. They learned to respond instantly to commands in languages they barely understood. Rewards were small and rare. Punishments were controlled and public enough to warn others without leaving marks. The goal was not pain, but predictability. Traders wanted women who appeared willing, because willingness commanded higher prices. Fear was reshaped into performance. The copper-haired woman learned to keep her face calm even when her hands shook. She learned to smile without meaning it. She learned that obedience did not stop the system, but it slowed its punishments. Time lost its shape inside these compounds. Days blurred together, measured only by meals and inspections. Some women broke quickly, crying or pleading, and were removed, reassigned to lower-value consignments. Others grew quiet, conserving themselves, hiding whatever remained inside. Traders watched closely. Too much spirit meant trouble. Too little meant illness. Balance was everything. The women were not told where they would be sold. Uncertainty was another tool. Fear of the unknown kept them compliant, guessing, hoping that cooperation might bring a gentler outcome. Hope here was manufactured and rationed like food. By the time buyers arrived, the transformation was complete. The women no longer looked like captives from burned villages. They looked like merchandise arranged for inspection. Benches were set. Chains were adjusted to allow movement but prevent escape. Traders spoke proudly of the care they had taken, of the condition of their goods. The copper-haired woman sat among them, posture straight, eyes lowered exactly as she had been taught. To the men approaching, she appeared calm, valuable, ready. No one could see the cost of that calm, the beliefs crushed, the past erased, the self reduced to something that fit neatly into a transaction. And as the first buyer stepped forward, coins already weighing his purse, the woman understood a final, devastating truth. Survival had not saved her, it had only made her more expensive. The river that devoured names. Not every woman reached the market alive. The river decided who was worth selling and who was not, and the chains were designed to make sure escape meant death. The eastern route began where hope finally collapsed. Once the consignments left Dublin and the Baltic staging posts, there was no turning back, no rumor of ransom, no illusion of rescue. The copper-haired woman was loaded onto a long, narrow boat already crowded with bodies and iron, the air heavy with damp wood and fear. Chains linked neck to neck, wrist to wrist, not simply to prevent escape, but to enforce collective punishment. If one woman stumbled during portage, all felt the pull. If one fell into the river, the others followed. Traders understood this well. The chain taught obedience faster than any whip. The Volga system was not a road. It was a test that stripped away the weak and sharpened the value of those who survived. Boats moved slowly, fighting currents, scraping shallows, stopping constantly to be dragged over land between rivers. During these portages, captives were forced to carry supplies, sometimes the boats themselves, their bare feet cutting on stone and root, while guards watched for collapse. Anyone who fell behind slowed profit. Anyone who slowed profit became a problem. Food was calculated carefully, enough to keep bodies moving, not enough to restore strength. Water came from the river, brown and unpredictable, carrying sickness that spread quickly among chained bodies. Coughs became fevers, fevers became silence. When a woman died, her weight dragged at the chain until the traders stopped, unlocked her collar, and let the river take her. There was no ceremony, no pause. Her absence simply shortened the chain. Fear deepened then, not in screams, but in the tightening of jaws and the hollowing of eyes. Every captive understood the lesson. Survival depended not on resistance, but on endurance. The river rewarded stillness. As weeks passed, the copper-haired woman watched faces change. Some grew vacant, some grew desperate. Some learned to move mechanically, preserving energy, copying the stillness of the traders themselves. Identity eroded faster than flesh. Names were forgotten, replaced by position in the chain. Memories surfaced only at night, when sleep refused to come, and the sound of water pressed against the hull like an accusation. Traders did not discourage this erosion. It made captives easier to manage, easier to present later as something newly shaped, rather than violently stolen. When the boats finally reached Bulgar, relief did not come. Bulgar was not an ending, it was a refinement. The city rose from the riverbank like a promise made of stone and silver, its markets already humming with buyers from distant lands. Here, the surviving women were unloaded and counted again, their reduced numbers increasing the value of those left. The copper-haired woman had survived months of exposure, disease, and death, and that survival itself made her more desirable. Traders began what they called restoration. Bodies were bathed, hair washed and styled, skin treated with oils to erase the visible marks of the journey. Weight was added carefully, injuries were concealed, the illusion of health was rebuilt piece by piece. It was important that buyers see only the product, not the process. Then came presentation. Garments unfamiliar to the women were chosen for them, selected not for comfort, but for appeal. Jewelry was added, not as kindness, but as decoration. The copper-haired woman barely recognized her reflection in the polished metal held before her. She looked composed, valuable, calm. That image would sell well. Behavior was rehearsed again, stricter now because Bulgar's buyers paid more and demanded more. Modesty, submission, silence unless spoken to, these were not virtues here, but specifications. Those who failed were removed quietly. Their fate was not discussed. As the market opened, the copper-haired woman was seated on a bench among others, her chain loosened just enough to allow inspection. Men approached, speaking languages she did not know, opening garments, examining teeth, touching skin, negotiating prices as if she were not present. She understood then that the river had not merely carried her here, it had erased her past completely. Whatever she had been before capture no longer mattered. She was not a person traveling forward. She was a commodity moving deeper into the world. And as the bidding began, she sensed that the river's final cruelty was this. It did not drown her. It delivered her, polished and silent, into hands that would decide the rest of her life with a purse of silver.
Silver, law, and the price of obedience. Here, cruelty wore clean robes and spoke the language of law. Chains were replaced by contracts, and pain was hidden behind procedure, because the most efficient systems never look violent at all. The market did not feel chaotic. That was the most unsettling part. At Bulgar and in the greater markets beyond it, everything followed order, rules, customs, expectations known to buyers and sellers alike. The copper-haired woman was seated beneath an awning, her posture perfect, her eyes lowered exactly as she had been trained. Around her moved merchants from Persia, Central Asia, and the southern cities, men whose wealth allowed them to travel thousands of miles to purchase what they desired. This was not desperation buying, this was selection. Traders spoke calmly, listing qualities like features on a ledger: age, health, origin, skills. The word Frankish carried weight, fair skin carried weight, survival of the river carried weight. Each detail added silver. The woman understood enough to know she was being evaluated not as a person, but as a future investment, someone who would serve.
produce, or symbolize status inside a household far from this riverbank. When the bargaining began, it was precise. Prices were discussed openly, objections raised politely, defects debated like minor inconveniences. Teeth were checked again, limbs were pressed, garments were opened without apology. No one asked permission. Law did not require it. In these markets, regulations existed, but they served commerce, not compassion. Buyers could reject merchandise that showed hidden illness. Sellers were expected to disclose flaws, not out of honesty, but to protect reputation. Taxes were levied on each sale, ensuring that governments, too, profited from this trade. Slavery here was not lawless, it was integrated. That made it durable. The copper-haired woman was purchased by a merchant whose accent suggested lands she had never heard named. The exchange of silver ended her time as inventory and began her time as property. Yet the traders did not release her immediately. There were final formalities, records, witnesses, assurances. She was now someone else's responsibility, someone else's asset. The chains were adjusted, not removed. Freedom was not part of the transaction. She was moved with others into a guarded enclosure to await the next stage of transport. Around her, some women were already crying quietly. Others stared ahead, empty again. One or two whispered prayers in languages that no one answered. This was where belief fractured completely. Some captives had imagined that sale meant an ending, that once purchased, the uncertainty would stop. But sale was only a transfer. Ownership changed hands. Control remained absolute. The copper-haired woman overheard fragments through translators. Caravans heading south, households needing servants, concubines valued for appearance, women trained further for courtly life. Each possibility carried its own fears. None carried choice. Yet this system maintained a strange illusion of order. Islamic law, like Byzantine law farther west, recognized limits on treatment. Owners were expected to provide food and clothing. Certain abuses were discouraged. Manumission was theoretically possible. These rules were often cited by merchants as evidence of morality. But rules did not erase the journey, the preparation, the isolation, the erasure of identity. They did not restore what had been taken. They only defined how profit would continue without interruption. As the days passed, the copper-haired woman noticed something more disturbing than violence: the silence of protest. No crowds objected, no priests condemned, no officials interfered. The system was too valuable, too normalized, too useful. It connected worlds, enriched cities, filled treasuries. To challenge it would be to challenge trade itself. That was why it endured. When the caravan finally assembled, the woman was bound again, this time with ropes and guards rather than chains. The river was behind her now. Ahead lay deserts, cities, and a life entirely determined by someone else's needs. As the gates of Bulgar closed behind the caravan, she understood a final truth. The market had not been the cruelest place she had known. It had been the calmest, and that calm meant the system worked exactly as it was designed to.
What history tried to bury. They called it trade, not trafficking. They praised ships and sagas, not the silence below deck. Because empires survive by choosing what not to remember. The copper-haired woman disappears from the record, not because her life ended, but because the system no longer needed to see her. Once she passed beyond Bulgar and into the household economies of the South, she became invisible to chroniclers who preferred victories, treaties, and kings. This disappearance is the final stage of the Viking slave trade, the part that history hid most carefully. Not the raids, not the markets, but the absorption. Women taken from Ireland, Francia, and the Slavic lands were folded into households across the Islamic world, Byzantium, and Scandinavia itself,
where their labor, bodies, and children were quietly consumed by societies that recorded everything except the suffering that sustained them. Historians later praised Viking exploration, craftsmanship, and bravery because these stories were easier to admire than a system that turned human beings into export goods. The slave trade was not forgotten by accident. It was minimized by design. Foreign observers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan preserved fragments because they stood outside the myth. They wrote what insiders normalized. Their accounts described chains, inspections, grooming, and sale with disturbing clarity, not because they sought scandal, but because they documented reality. Archaeology now confirms what those texts suggested. Trading posts aligned perfectly with river routes, holding enclosures large enough for human cargo, objects of restraint found far from battlefields, DNA evidence in modern populations revealing Northern European women absorbed into distant regions. These are not coincidences, they are fingerprints of a system. The final cruelty of this trade was not violence, but erasure. Women lost their names first, then their language, then their gods, then even their memory as victims. In sagas, enslaved women appear only as background figures, unnamed wives, unnamed mothers, unnamed servants whose presence is implied but never explained. Their suffering became invisible the moment it became useful, and usefulness is history's favorite excuse. Some women adapted. Sources suggest a range of outcomes. A few learned new languages, bore children, gained limited protection under law, sometimes even freedom. These cases are often cited to soften the narrative, but adaptation is not absolution. Survival inside a cage does not justify the cage. For every woman who found a measure of stability, countless others vanished into households where their lives were defined entirely by obedience. Unsold women, older women, those deemed difficult, were quietly disposed of, reassigned, or abused without record. This too was part of the system, hidden behind vague phrases and careful omissions. What makes this history uncomfortable is not just what the Vikings did, but how familiar it feels. The mechanisms, capture, sorting, preparation, transport, and sale, are the same mechanisms repeated in later slave systems across the world. The language changes, the justifications change, the profit remains. That is why this story matters, not because it condemns one culture, but because it exposes a pattern humans repeat whenever commerce outruns conscience. The copper-haired woman's fate cannot be recovered. She does not return home. She does not leave a named grave. She exists only as a shadow passing through records written by men who never learned her name. But her journey reveals something history cannot erase. Civilization has often been built not only by explorers and kings, but by the silent labor and suffering of people whose stories were never meant to survive. The Viking world was not unique in this. It was simply efficient. And that is the final, darkest truth. The most dangerous systems are not fueled by hatred alone, but by routine, profit, and the comforting belief that this is just how the world works. The river carried ships, silver, and slaves without judgment. History did the same. It kept moving forward, choosing which stories to celebrate and which to drown. And if we listen carefully to the sources that remain, we can still hear the chains beneath the sagas, reminding us that what a civilization chooses to forget often defines it more than what it remembers.